Hello students. So in today's class we are going to study about classification, that is of chapter number 7. Now classification, it refers to identification and grouping of similar organisms. The similar organisms are identified and then grouped on the basis of their form and function. We write their forms and functions when they are classified into groups. So, what is the basis of classification? Why do we classify? Attempt at classifying living things into groups have been made since time immemorial. Greek thinker Aristotle, he classified animals according to whether they lived on land, in water, or in air. So, Aristotle was the first one to classify animals according to. He classified the organisms in the way the whether they lived on land, whether they lived in water, or in the air. This is a very simple way of looking at life, but it is misleading too. For examples, animals that live in the sea include corals, whales, octopuses, starfish, and sharks. So, we can immediately see that these are very different from each other in numerous ways, right? So, in fact, habitat is the only point they share in common, that is, they live in sea. That is the only thing that they share in common. So, this is not an appropriate way of making groups of organisms to study and think about. So, we therefore need to decide which characteristics to be used as the basis for making the broadest division, which characteristic we should use to make the broadest division. Then we will have to pick the next set of characteristic for making subgroups. Then we also have to make the subgroups from that classes or groups. So that's why we will then pick up the next set of characteristic. So this process of classification within each group can then continue using these new characteristics each time. So each time we will classify new characteristics. So before we go on, we need to think about what is meant by characteristic. Here we are discussing that they should share the similar characteristic. But what characteristic? What type of characteristic? So, when we are trying to classify a diverse group of organisms, we need to find ways in which some of them are similar enough to be thought of together. These ways, in fact, are details of appearance or behavior, and in other words, form and function. These are the characteristic. Form and function, we term it as characteristic. So now, to understand how some characteristics are decided as being more fundamental than others, let us consider how a stone wall is built. So let us consider the stones used will have different shapes and sizes, right? The stones that are used for a stone wall to build have different shapes and sizes, and the stones at the top of the wall would not influence the choice of stones that come below them, right? So the stones that are on the top of the wall, they would not influence the choice of stones. So on the other hand, the shapes and sizes of stones in the lowermost layer will decide the shape and sizes of the next layer, right? So the shape and sizes of the stones that are present in the lowermost layer, that will only decide the shape and sizes of the next layer, and so on. So the stone in the lowermost layer are like the characteristics that decide the broadest division among living organisms, right? So the characteristic that decide the broadest division among the living organism, that is the lowest layer. So they are independent of any other characteristic. They are independent. They do not have to follow any characteristic in their effect on the form and function. So the characteristics in the next level would be dependent on the previous one, right? And that would decide the variety in the next level. So in this way, we can build up a whole hierarchy of mutually related characteristics to be used for classification. This way we can build up a whole hierarchy. So nowadays we look at many interrelated characteristics starting from the nature of the cell in order to classify all living organisms. So what are some concrete examples of such characteristics used for hierarchical classification that we will see? So first, let's study the importance of classification. That is, it makes the study of a wide variety of organisms easy, right? We can easily study the wide variety of organisms. It projects the pictures of all life forms at a glance. It gives us a picture of all the life forms in one glance, in one way. It is essential to understand the interrelationship among different groups of organisms, right? We have to understand the interrelationships among different groups of organisms, and it forms the base of development of other biological sciences. It gives us the base of development of other biological sciences. So now the classification is done in two ways. There is 2-kingdom classification and 5-kingdom classification. But before that, let's see the examples. Let's study the examples of characteristic. As if suppose a eukaryotic cell has membrane bound organelles, which includes a nucleus, which allows cellular processes to be carried efficiently in isolation from each other. Therefore, organisms which do not have a clearly demarcated nucleus and other organelles would need to have their biochemical pathways organized in very different ways. This would have an effect on every aspect of cell design. So further, nucleated cell would have the capacity to participate in making a multicellular organism because they can take up specialized function. Therefore, nucleus can be a basic characteristic of classification. That is the first characteristic. So, second, do the cells occur singly or are they grouped together? And do they live as an indivisible group? So, cells that group together to form a single organism use the principle of division of labor. In such a body design, all cells would not be identical. So instead, groups of cells will carry out specialized function, and this makes a very basic distinction in the body designs of organism. As a result, an amoeba and a worm are very different in their body design. So body design could be the next characteristic. These are just the examples of characteristics I am giving you, that how would we find out that what type of characteristic an organism should possess so that it could be classified in different groups. So these are just the examples. Now, do organisms produce their own food through the process of photosynthesis? Now, being able to produce one's own food versus having to get food from outside would make very different body designs necessarily. So that would be another characteristic. Now, of the organisms that perform photosynthesis, that is plants, what is the level of organization of their body? Of the animals, how does the individual's body develop and organize its different parts? And what are the specialized organs found for different functions? So, of the animals, if animals are there, how does the individual's body develop? How do its body develop? And how organize its different part? How can we organize its different part? This could be other characteristic. Now, we can see even in these few questions that we have asked, a hierarchy is developing, right? So, the characteristics of body design used for classification of plants will be very different from those important for classifying animals. So this is because the basic designs are different based on the need to make their own food or acquire it, right? So this is because the basic designs are different based on the need to make their own food and to acquire it. So what happens here, that therefore these designs are to be used to make subgroups rather than making broad groups. So to classify this way, we can classify the organisms based on the characteristics. So classification is done by two ways, 2 kingdom and 5 kingdom. 2 kingdom classification. So before that, let's study about the classification and evolution. All the living things are identified and categorized on the basis of their body design in form and function, right? So some characteristics are likely to make more wide-ranging changes in body design than others. Some make very huge changes in the body design from one as compared to the other. And there is a role of time in this as well. So once a certain body design of comes into existence, it will shape the effects of all other subsequent design changes, words changes, simply because it already exists, right? In other words, characteristics that came into existence earlier are likely to be more basic than characteristics that have come into existence later. This means that the classification of life forms will be closely related to their evolution, that how the organisms are evolved and how can they be characterized. So what is evolution? Most life forms that we see today have arisen by an accumulation of changes in body design that allow the organism possessing them to survive better. So the life forms that we today, it is just how do they arise? By the accumulation of changes. The changes that are occurring, they all the changes, they come together, they accumulate, and they allow the organisms possessing them to survive better. Charles Darwin first described this idea of evolution. He was the first to describe the idea of evolution in 1859 in his book, that is The Origin of Species. He gave the book Origin of Species, and that he gave the idea of evolution. Now, when we connect this idea of evolution to classification, we will find some groups of organisms which have ancient body design that have not changed very much, right? So there are some designs of the organisms which have not changed very much. They might have changed, but they undergo minor changes. So we will also find other groups of organisms that have acquired their particular body design relatively recently. So those in the first group are frequently referred to as primitive or lower organisms, while those in the second group are called advanced or higher organisms. Those who have undergone minor changes, they are called as primitive or lower organism, and those who have undergone the huge changes, and these are termed as advanced or higher organism. In reality, these terms are not quite correct. They are not quite correct since they do not properly relate to the differences. It can't give us differences between organisms. Through these words, we can't relate the differences, right? So all that we can say is that some are older organisms while some are younger organisms. So we can say that they are older, we are younger. Since there is a possibility that complexity in design will increase, the complexity in their design will increase over evolutionary time. It may not be wrong to say that older organisms are simpler while younger organisms are more complex, right? So this way we can do that. With evolution the changes are coming, and on the basis of that classification is done. So two kingdom classification is, as we know, there are a lot of differences between plants and animals, right, related to their food habits, cell structure, etc. So therefore the classification was done as plant kingdom and animal kingdom. This was the two kingdom classification, means they were divided into two kingdoms, plant kingdom and animal kingdom. Then this classification was suggested by Carolus Linnaeus in 1758. But as more and more diverse forms were discovered, this classification took a back seat and a new system was proposed, that is five kingdom classification. Now, if we just classify into two kingdoms, plant kingdom and animal kingdom, but there are number of plant species. Now, how can we identify that which plant species are there? So that's why the plant species are also classified. So they should be also classified. So that's why there come the new system, which is five kingdom classification. Five kingdom classification was given by R.H. Whittaker. R.H. Whittaker in 1959, that is Robert H. Whittaker. According to it, the organisms are classified into five kingdoms. That is, first kingdom is the kingdom Monera. Kingdom Monera consists of prokaryotic bacteria and blue-green algae. These two are comes under kingdom Monera. Second is the kingdom Protista. Kingdom Protista consists of unicellular eukaryotic organisms, that is protozoan, fungi and algae. Then comes the kingdom Fungi. It consists of higher fungi. Then comes the Plantae. It consists of multicellular green plants and advanced algae. Then comes the kingdom Animalia, which consists of all multicellular organisms. So, this classification was based on three aspects: prokaryotic versus eukaryotic, unicellular versus multicellular, and modes of nutrition. There were three types. With this, we complete the classification. This was just the introduction of classification. Now, in the next class, we will study about the hierarchy of classification groups, and we will study about this five kingdom classification. That is, we will study about all these five kingdoms in detail. So, that's all for today. I hope you are clear with the concepts that are taught today. Thank you and have a great